We're going to move on now from looking at explanations for how our memories work, and instead we're going to start looking at explanations for forgetting. And there are two main explanations that you need to know for your exam. So the two explanations are interference theory and cue-dependent forgetting. So we will tackle them one at a time. Interference theory is the idea that one piece of information can interfere with or hinder or disrupt the recall of another piece of information. Now, there are two types of interference that can occur: retroactive interference and proactive interference. Now, people often lose marks in the exam because they get these the wrong way round. So it is very, very important that you remember which way round is which. So retroactive interference, if we look on the left-hand side of the diagram for the moment, is when a new piece of information, so something that you learnt second, interferes with how well you can remember the first piece of information. Proactive interference on the right-hand side of the diagram is the opposite of that. So old information interferes with how well you can remember new information. Now, in these examples, the names Julie and Judy, which are the pieces of information you're trying to remember, are very, very similar. This is important for interference theory because the more similar the information you're learning, the more likely it is that one will interfere with the other. Now, in retroactive interference, you would be unable to remember the word or the name Julie, which you learn first, because the similar name Judy has interfered with that, which means you can't recall it. In proactive interference, it's the opposite way round. So you'd be unable to remember, for example, a new colleague's name, if their name was Julie, because your old colleague may have been called Julie, so you keep calling her Julie instead. Now, the way I remember this, retroactive, the word retro, often you think of going backwards, you think of the past. So I put the term working in front of that, as in working backwards, or interfering with something in the past. Proactive interference, you're thinking forwards. So again, if you put the word working in front of that, working forwards, it's interfering something which is in advance of the first piece of information that you learnt. The second explanation for forgetting that you need to know is cue-dependent forgetting. And this is based on the idea that when we encode information, so when we try and remember information or it enters our memory, there are certain cues which will be present either in the environment or in our own personal state that will help us to remember that information when we come to recall it. Now, if those cues for some reason are not there when we try to recall information, we then struggle to remember that particular piece of information. So the first type of cue-dependent forgetting is context-dependent. So context-dependent refers to your environment around you. You can relate this to studying. So, for example, if you study in an environment which is maybe very different to that in which you take your exams, maybe you go down to a local coffee shop and you study there, it's noisy, there are lots of people around you, you're quite relaxed. When you go into the exam hall, the environment is very, very different, and it might be more difficult for you to remember the information you need for your paper. Whereas, if you can study in a classroom or a place which is as similar to the exam hall as possible, those cues that you use or that are present when you're encoding the information will also be present when you're trying to recall it in the exam, and you're more likely to remember the information. The second type of cue-dependent forgetting is state-dependent forgetting, and this is more to do with your personal state. So if you're feeling very, very relaxed when you remember a piece of information, and you're also feeling relaxed when you try and recall it, you're far more likely to remember it. If you're feeling stressed when you're trying to recall it, you're less likely to remember it. If you go and have a look at the pre-reading on this particular topic, you'll find that there's another couple of explanations for forgetting that are covered. So you can go and read the extension material if you're interested, but do make sure either way that when you come into the lesson, you can explain the basic concepts behind interference and cue-dependent explanations for forgetting. You can accurately explain the difference between retroactive and proactive explanations for forgetting. and you can explain the difference between context-dependent and state-dependent forgetting.